an arrogant billionaire trapped in a wheelchair for years, lived mocking everything he couldn't buy. When mocking a girl who was playing at healing in the park, he shot out sarcastically, "I'll make you a millionaire if you heal me." She just touched him in silence and then left, ignoring his cruel laughter. But that very night the impossible happened, and he never laughed the same way again. Richard Thornton's gleaming wheelchair caught the late afternoon sunlight as it moved silently along the paved paths of Riverview Park. His assistants had cleared a small section near the playground where children's laughter floated through the crisp autumn air. 5 years had passed since the stroke that had rendered his legs useless, but the hard lines of his face had only grown sharper with time. The wheelchair might have restricted his movement, but it hadn't dampened his ambition or his notorious temper. "Mr. Thornton, your 4 o'clock meeting has been pushed to tomorrow," his assistant Melissa said as she walked briskly beside him. "Would you like to head back to the office?" Richard waved her away with a manicured hand. "No, leave me. I need fresh air." His voice came out rougher than intended, but he'd long stopped caring about how he sounded to others. At 62, Richard Thornton had amassed a fortune that placed him firmly among America's elite. Thornton Enterprises dominated the Boston skyline, with investments stretching from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. Newspapers called him the Emperor of New England real estate. Before the stroke, he'd been photographed with presidents and royalty. Now, he preferred solitude, managing his empire from behind closed doors, seeing only those necessary to maintain his wealth. The doctors had told him his condition was permanent. The neural pathways are too damaged, they'd said with practiced sympathy. He'd fired them all, hired specialists from Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. They'd all reached the same conclusion. His legs would never work again. So he'd poured millions into research, funded experimental treatments, and explored alternative medicines. Nothing had worked. The great Richard Thornton, who had built skyscrapers and transformed entire neighborhoods, couldn't fix his own broken body. The irony wasn't lost on him. It had turned his heart to stone. As his wheelchair glided past the playground, he noticed a group of children playing an elaborate game. They wore makeshift white coats fashioned from bedsheets, carrying twigs wrapped in aluminum foil as pretend stethoscopes. A little boy lay on a bench while 2 girls waved their hands over him, mimicking some sort of healing ritual. "The patient is very sick," one girl announced dramatically. "We need emergency surgery." "I can cure him with my magic doctor powers," the second girl proclaimed, wiggling her fingers theatrically over the giggling boy. Richard snorted, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He guided his wheelchair closer, watching the children's play acting with growing contempt. Their innocence irritated him. Their belief in make-believe grated against his pragmatism. He'd long ago lost patience for such foolishness. "And what exactly are you curing him of?" Richard called out, causing the children to pause their game and turn toward him. "Magic doctor powers. Is that what they're teaching in medical school these days?" The children stared at him, their joy momentarily stunned into silence by the bitter old man interrupting their game. "We're just playing," one brave boy finally said. "Playing at nonsense," Richard replied. "There's no such thing as magic healing. Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much you pretend." His voice carried the weight of his personal frustration, but the children only saw a mean old man in a fancy wheelchair. They gathered their props and moved further away, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders. Richard felt a twisted satisfaction at having dispersed their silly game. If he couldn't enjoy the simple pleasure of walking, why should he tolerate watching children pretend they could fix the unfixable? That's when he noticed her. A girl standing apart from the group, observing him with an intensity that was unsettling for someone so young. She wore a faded blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Unlike the other children, she didn't seem frightened by his outburst. Instead, she regarded him with a steady gaze that bordered on defiance. Something about her calm assessment irritated Richard even more than the other children's game. He maneuvered his wheelchair toward her, expecting her to run off like the others. She didn't move. "What are you staring at?" he demanded. "A man who needs help," she replied simply. Her response caught him off guard. He'd expected fear, maybe tears, but not this straightforward assessment delivered with such confidence. "I don't need help from anyone, especially not from a child playing pretend doctor," Richard scoffed. "You're in a wheelchair," she stated matter-of-factly, "and you're angry about it." Richard felt his face flush with anger. "What are you, some kind of playground therapist?" Go back to your little friends and their make-believe hospital. They're not my friends, she said. I was just watching. I don't play doctor. I heal. The absurdity of her statement made Richard laugh, a harsh sound that hadn't escaped his lips in years. The girl didn't flinch. You heal? Is that so? He leaned forward in his wheelchair, a cruel challenge forming in his mind. Tell you what, little healer, if you can make me walk again, I'll make you a millionaire. $1 million for a miracle. How does that sound? He expected her to realize the impossibility of his challenge, to recognize his mockery, and run away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with those unnervingly calm eyes. Prepare the check, she said. For a moment, Richard was speechless. Then he laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. The girl's audacity was almost refreshing after years of people tiptoeing around him. Well, go on then, he taunted. Work your magic. I'm waiting for my miracle. To his surprise, the girl approached without hesitation. She knelt beside his wheelchair, her movements deliberate and assured. Richard glanced around, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But the park continued its normal afternoon activities around them. Joggers on the paths, mothers watching their children, elderly couples feeding pigeons. The girl placed her small hands on his right leg, just above the knee. Richard felt nothing, of course. That part of him had been dead for years. Her eyes closed in concentration, her breathing slow and measured. She remained completely still for nearly a minute. Richard watched with growing impatience, torn between amusement and irritation at this charade. Just as he was about to tell her to stop the nonsense, she moved to his left leg, repeating the same process. Finally, she stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. That's it? Richard asked incredulously. That's your great healing power? Touching my legs and closing your eyes? It takes time, she said. The body remembers how to heal itself. Sometimes it just needs a reminder. Well, that was certainly underwhelming, Richard said with a dismissive wave. You'll have to do better than that if you want my $1 million. The girl shrugged, seemingly unconcerned with his skepticism. You'll know where to find me when it happens. When what happens? Richard called after her as she began to walk away. She turned back briefly. When you stand up again. Richard watched her disappear toward the playground, a strange unease settling over him. The encounter had been bizarre, but he quickly dismissed it as the foolish imagination of a child. He signaled to Melissa, who had been waiting at a respectful distance, to bring the car around. It was time to return to his penthouse apartment, where reality made more sense than playground encounters with strange children who believed they could perform miracles. That night, as Richard prepared for bed, assisted by his night nurse into his silk pajamas, he recalled the girl's confident words with a mixture of bitterness and amusement. The audacity of her to think she could accomplish what millions of dollars and the world's best medical minds could not. Will there be anything else, Mr. Thornton? The nurse asked, adjusting his pillows. No, he replied curtly. Leave me. Alone in the darkness of his bedroom overlooking the glittering Boston skyline, Richard couldn't shake the memory of the girl's steady gaze, her absolute certainty. Prepare the check, she had said, as if healing a severed spinal connection was as simple as turning on a light. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself as he drifted toward sleep. In his dreams, he was running through Riverview Park, his legs strong and sure beneath him, while a girl in a blue dress watched from a distance, smiling. Richard awakened abruptly at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat, despite the carefully regulated temperature of his penthouse. Something felt different, wrong, or perhaps not wrong, but unfamiliar. He lay still in the darkness, trying to identify the strange sensation coursing through his body. Then it hit him. A tingling. No, more than that. A prickling, buzzing feeling in his legs. The same legs that had felt nothing but phantom pains for 5 years. Impossible, he whispered into the darkness. He reached down hesitantly, touching his right thigh. The sensation intensified under his fingers, actual physical sensation. He pressed harder, pinched the flesh, and felt it. Actually felt it. Richard fumbled for the call button beside his bed, his heart racing. When his night nurse, Eleanor, rushed in moments later, she found him sitting upright, both hands clutching his legs. Mr. Thornton? Are you all right? Concern etched across her face as she turned on the bedside lamp. My legs, he said, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. I can feel them. Eleanor's professional demeanor faltered momentarily. Are you sure it's not just phantom sensation? Dr. Reynolds mentioned that might happen occasionally. Test it, Richard commanded. Pinch my leg. Anywhere. Eleanor hesitated but followed his instruction, gently pinching his calf through the silk pajamas. There, Richard exclaimed. I felt that. Do it again, harder. For the next hour, Richard demanded increasingly thorough tests of sensation. By dawn, there was no denying it. Feeling had returned to his previously numb limbs. When Eleanor suggested helping him into his wheelchair as usual, Richard waved her away. Call Dr. Bennett, now, and tell him to get here within the hour if he wants to keep his position at Boston General. Dr. Bennett arrived in 45 minutes, medical bag in hand and sleep still clouding his eyes. His examination was thorough, his expression growing increasingly perplexed with each test. This is unusual, Mr. Thornton, he finally said, removing his stethoscope. The nerve responses are definitely active. You're showing signs of significant neurological recovery, which frankly contradicts everything we understood about your condition. Can I walk? Richard demanded. I wouldn't advise attempting that just yet. These signs are promising, but help me stand, Richard interrupted, already pushing himself toward the edge of the bed. Dr. Bennett exchanged concerned glances with Eleanor, but moved to support Richard's attempt. With one arm around the doctor's shoulders and Eleanor steadying him from the other side, Richard slid his feet to the floor. His legs trembled violently under his weight. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort. But for 3 glorious seconds, Richard Thornton stood on his own 2 feet before his knees buckled, and they carefully lowered him back to the bed. My God, Dr. Bennett murmured. This is unprecedented. Richard barely heard him. His mind was racing back to yesterday afternoon, to a girl in a faded blue dress kneeling by his wheelchair. Prepare the check, she had said. Mr. Thornton, we need to get you to the hospital for comprehensive testing. This kind of spontaneous recovery is extremely rare, and we need to understand. Schedule whatever tests you need for tomorrow, Richard cut him off. Today I have something more important to do. By noon, Richard had assembled a small team from his corporate security department in his home office. His executive assistant, Melissa, stood nervously by his wheelchair. He'd insisted on using it until he could walk properly, clutching her tablet. I need you to find someone, Richard told the head of security, a former FBI agent named Carson. A girl, approximately 11 or 12 years old. Dark hair, blue dress. I encountered her yesterday at Riverview Park around 4:30 p.m. Carson nodded, making notes. Any other identifying characteristics? Name? Was she with an adult? No name, she was alone. Richard frowned, realizing how little information he had. She was different, calm, confident. She claimed she could heal people. The security team exchanged skeptical glances that Richard pretended not to notice. Review all security camera footage from the park. Interview the regular vendors, the maintenance staff, anyone who might have seen her. I want to know who she is and where she lives by the end of the day. May I ask why this child is so important, sir? Carson ventured carefully. Richard's fingers tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. Because she did something impossible, he said quietly, and I need to understand how. The team deployed immediately, leaving Richard alone with Melissa. Sir, you have the board meeting at 3, she reminded him gently. Should I reschedule? No, Richard said, wheeling himself toward the window overlooking the city. But add an agenda item. I want preliminary reports on all our community impact assessments for the Riverside Development Project. Community impact? Melissa repeated, surprised. In 15 years working for Richard Thornton, she'd never heard him express interest in the community consequences of his developments. Yes, he said, still gazing out the window. I want to know exactly who we've displaced. The board meeting proceeded as usual, with one notable exception. Richard remained strangely quiet through the financial reports and market projections that typically engaged him most. When they reached his newly added agenda item, he suddenly became attentive. The Riverside development required clearing approximately 6 blocks of older residential buildings, the project manager explained, slightly uncomfortable under Richard's intense scrutiny. Most residents accepted our relocation packages. Most? Richard questioned. What about the rest? The room fell awkwardly silent. Well, sir, about 30 families refused the initial offers. Legal handled the necessary eviction processes. Where did they go? Richard pressed. The project manager glanced around for support. That wasn't tracked as part of our metrics. Richard's expression hardened. Start tracking it. I want to know where every displaced family ended up. Names, current addresses, compensation received. Everything. The meeting concluded with uncomfortable murmurs and concerned glances. Richard Thornton, showing interest in displaced residents, was as unexpected as his legs suddenly healing. When Richard returned to his penthouse that evening, Carson was waiting with a preliminary report. We've reviewed all security footage and interviewed 17 park employees, he said. No clear identification yet, but 3 regular park visitors mentioned seeing a girl matching your description. She apparently comes to the park occasionally, always alone. One ice cream vendor thought she might live in the West Side area, possibly near the old Blackwell Elementary School. Blackwell, Richard repeated. Isn't that the school that closed last year? Yes, sir, budget cuts. The building's been vacant since then, or officially vacant at least. Richard caught the implication immediately. What do you mean by officially? Carson shifted slightly. There are rumors that some homeless families have been using it as shelter. Nothing confirmed, but... Take me there, Richard interrupted. Now. Sir, that neighborhood isn't exactly safe, especially after dark. Perhaps tomorrow with proper... Now, Carson. An hour later, Richard's custom Mercedes pulled up half a block from the abandoned school building. The neighborhood had clearly seen better days. Boarded storefronts lined the street, and the few pedestrians hurried past with heads down and collars turned up against the evening chill. Sir, please reconsider, Carson said from the driver's seat. Let us scout the location first. If the girl is living here, we can approach during daylight with proper... Wait here, Richard said, already maneuvering himself into his wheelchair with practiced movements. Carson reluctantly helped him onto the sidewalk. At least let me accompany you. No. Stay with the car. Richard had a strange feeling that arriving with security would close doors rather than open them. I'll be fine. The wheelchair hummed quietly as Richard approached the school building. Faded lettering above the entrance still proudly proclaimed, Blackwell Elementary building tomorrow's leaders. Most windows were boarded up, but soft light flickered from a few ground-floor rooms, confirming Carson's suspicions about unofficial residents. Richard hesitated at the bottom of the access ramp. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. The girl had done something impossible, something that 5 years of the world's best medical care couldn't accomplish. What if it was temporary? What if seeing her again somehow reversed the miracle? As he sat contemplating these unsettling thoughts, the side door of the school creaked open. A sliver of warm light spilled onto the cracked concrete, and a small figure stepped out into the evening air. Even in the dim light, Richard recognized her immediately. The same calm eyes, the same direct gaze. She wore different clothes now, jeans and a worn sweatshirt, but carried herself with that same unsettling composure. How you found me faster than I expected, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. Richard's throat suddenly felt dry. You knew I would come? You stood up. It wasn't a question. Yes. Richard wheeled himself closer. How did you know? How did you do it? The girl studied him for a long moment. You should come inside, she finally said. And my grandmother will want to meet you. Your grandmother? She taught me everything I know. The girl held the door open wider. She said you'd come looking for answers. She also said you might not like what you find. Richard stared at the open door, at the girl whose impossible abilities had shattered his understanding of reality. Beyond her lay answers he wasn't sure he was ready for, truths he couldn't predict. I'm Lily, by the way, she said, a hint of a smile touching her lips. You should know my name if you're going to write me that check. Richard Thornton, who had built his empire on calculated risks and fearless decisions, found himself hesitating on the threshold of an abandoned elementary school. But the tingling in his legs that had been dead to sensation for 5 years, propelled him forward into the warm light beyond the door, toward answers that would forever change his life. The interior of Blackwell Elementary School was a study in contradictions. The hallway retained its institutional character. Beige walls lined with empty bulletin boards, scuffed linoleum floors bearing the ghosts of countless small footprints. But signs of makeshift domesticity had transformed the abandoned space. Battery-powered lanterns created pools of warm light, salvaged furniture clustered in classroom doorways, and the unmistakable aroma of cooking filled the air. Richard followed Lily down the corridor, acutely aware of curious eyes watching from darkened doorways as his wheelchair hummed along the worn floor. Children's whispers echoed in his wake. "How many people live here?" he asked, trying to mask his discomfort. 27 families, Lily replied without turning. 8 more than last month. She led him to what had once been the school library. Bookshelves still lined the walls, though many stood empty. In the center of the room, mismatched tables had been pushed together to create a communal dining area. Several adults looked up from their meals as Richard entered, their expressions shifting from surprise to wariness. An elderly woman sat at the head of the longest table, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her evident age, she sat straight-backed with the same calm alertness Richard had observed in Lily. She watched his approach with sharp, assessing eyes. "Grandma," Lily said, "this is the man from the park." The old woman nodded slowly. "I can see that." Her voice carried a hint of an accent Richard couldn't quite place. "Richard Thornton himself, coming to our humble home. This is an unexpected honor." Richard was taken aback. "You know who I am?" A smile touched the woman's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone in this room knows who you are, Mr. Thornton." The atmosphere in the room seemed to tighten, charged with an emotion Richard couldn't identify. He glanced around, noting how the other adults studied him with a mixture of caution and what might have been resentment. "I came to speak with Lily," he said, redirecting his attention to the old woman. "I believe we have business to discuss." "I'm Eleanor Wilson," the woman said, "Lily's grandmother and guardian. Any business you have with my granddaughter, you have with me." She gestured to an empty space at the table. "Join us for dinner. We don't have much, but we share what we have." Richard hesitated. In his world, invitations came with elegant cards and formal RSVPs, not casual offers to join strangers at mismatched tables in abandoned buildings. But curiosity and the persistent tingling in his legs compelled him forward. A young woman quickly cleared a space for his wheelchair at the table. Someone else brought a chipped plate with a modest serving of rice and beans. The domesticity of the scene felt surreal to Richard, who couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten in company rather than alone in his penthouse. "Thank you," he said awkwardly, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "So," Eleanor said after Richard had taken a few hesitant bites, "my granddaughter has worked a miracle for you." Richard set down his fork. "That's what I came to understand. How did she do it? What exactly happened to me?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with Lily before answering. "In our culture, we believe some people are born with a gift, the ability to remind the body of its original purpose. Lily has this gift." "Your culture?" Richard asked. "My late husband was Navajo," Eleanor explained. "I lived on the reservation with him for 40 years before coming to Boston after his passing. Lily's mother, my daughter, married a local man here. After they both passed in a car accident, Lily came to live with me." Richard absorbed this information, his analytical mind searching for rational explanations. "So this is some kind of Native American healing practice?" Eleanor's expression cooled slightly. "It's not a practice, Mr. Thornton. It's a gift, a responsibility. Lily was born with an unusual connection to the energy that flows through all living things. She can sense when that energy is blocked, and sometimes, not always, help restore its proper flow. Energy flows. Forgive me, Mrs. Wilson, but I've consulted with the best neurologists in the world. They all agreed my condition was permanent. The nerve pathways were severed. And now suddenly I can feel my legs again. I stood up today, however briefly. That's not energy flow, that's a medical impossibility. Yet here you are," Eleanor said simply. Richard turned to Lily, who had been quietly eating her dinner. "Why me? Why offer to help me in the park?" Lily looked up from her plate. "You were suffering, and you were making others suffer because of your pain." Her simple assessment struck Richard like a physical blow. Before he could formulate a response, a commotion at the library entrance drew everyone's attention. Carson appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 other security team members. His hand rested suggestively near his concealed weapon as he surveyed the room. "Mr. Thornton," he called, tension evident in his voice. "You've been in here too long, we need to go." Richard felt a flash of irritation at the interruption. "Everything's fine, Carson. These people have kindly offered me dinner. Carson approached the table, leaning down to speak quietly in Richard's ear. "Sir, we're in an abandoned building filled with squatters. This is a serious security risk. We should leave immediately." "Squatters?" The word was spoken by a tall, broad-shouldered man who had risen from his seat further down the table. "Is that what we are to you? Squatters?" Richard noticed several other adults standing now, the atmosphere in the room shifting from cautious to confrontational. "Marcus," Eleanor said firmly, "this isn't helpful." The man, Marcus, kept his eyes fixed on Richard. "Do you even know who we are, Mr. Thornton? Do you have any idea?" Richard felt a creeping discomfort. "I understand your families who've fallen on hard times. We're the people you evicted from Riverside," Marcus cut in, his voice tight with controlled anger. "All of us. We're the acceptable losses from your development project." A cold sensation spread through Richard's chest as he looked around the room with new understanding. These weren't random homeless families. These were the very people his latest project had displaced, the ones who hadn't accepted the relocation packages, as his project manager had so clinically phrased it. Eleanor reached into a canvas bag beside her chair and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, which she placed carefully on the table in front of Richard. He recognized himself immediately, standing at a podium with a ceremonial shovel, his company's logo prominently displayed on the banner behind him. The headline read, "Thornton Enterprises breaks ground on 500 million Riverside renewal." "This was 7 months ago," Eleanor said quietly. "The day after this photo was taken, bulldozers arrived at our apartment building with no warning. We had lived there for 15 years. Marcus and his family had been there for 20. None of us had signed anything or agreed to move." Richard shook his head. "That's impossible. Legal protocols require proper notification, compensation negotiations for property owners," Marcus interjected, "not for renters in month-to-month agreements. Our landlord sold to your company without telling us. We came home from work to find our belongings on the street and padlocks on the doors." Richard looked to Carson, hoping for some contradiction, but his security chief's uncomfortable expression confirmed the story. "The relocation assistance your company offered wouldn't cover first and last month's rent in any safe neighborhood," Eleanor continued. "Most of us ended up in temporary shelters until Marcus discovered this building standing empty. We've been here since the school district abandoned it." Richard stared at the newspaper photo, at his own triumphant smile as he celebrated a project that had destroyed these people's lives. The realization struck him with unexpected force. His wheelchair wasn't the only thing that had kept him isolated from reality. "I wasn't aware of these details," he finally managed, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Of course you weren't," Marcus said, his voice softer now but no less pointed. "Men like you never are." Lily, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. "This is why I helped you," she said, drawing Richard's attention. "Not for the money. I wanted you to find us, to see what happened because of your choices." Richard looked at the girl with new understanding. This hadn't been a random encounter in the park. She had recognized him, known exactly who he was and what his company had done. "The $1 million, he said, reaching for his phone. "I can transfer it immediately. It won't undo what happened, but it could help all of you find proper housing." To his surprise, Lily shook her head. "We don't want your money, Mr. Thornton." "Then what do you want?" "Our homes back," Marcus said simply. "The Riverside properties have already been demolished," Richard replied. "The new development is halfway complete." Eleanor placed a weathered hand on Richard's arm, the first time anyone had touched him with such casual familiarity in years. "What we really want, Mr. Thornton, is for you to see us. Not as obstacles to your business or problems to be solved with money, but as people whose lives matter." The room fell silent. Richard became acutely aware of the faces around him, the dignity in their expressions despite their circumstances, the resilience evident in the order they had created from chaos, the community they had built from shared hardship. For the first time in his career, Richard Thornton saw the human cost of his success with perfect clarity. Carson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, it's getting late. We should really—" "I'd like to stay a while longer," Richard interrupted. "In fact, I'd like to hear more about everyone's situation." He turned to Eleanor. "If that's acceptable to you." Surprise flickered across the older woman's face, quickly replaced by a cautious nod. "We have many stories to share, Mr. Thornton, if you're truly willing to listen." And so, as the evening deepened around them, Richard Thornton, the emperor of New England real estate, the man whose signature had displaced these very families, listened. He learned names and occupations, heard about children's interrupted educations and adults' lost jobs. He discovered that Marcus had been a construction foreman before a workplace injury left him unemployable, that a young mother named Sophia had been 2 semesters away from a nursing degree when the eviction forced her to drop out. With each story, the tingling in his legs seemed to intensify, as if his physical healing and this new awareness were somehow connected. By the time Carson finally convinced him to leave, well past midnight, Richard Thornton was a changed man, not just physically but in ways far more profound. As Lily walked him to the door, Richard turned to her one last time. "The check. Keep it," she said, "for now. But I promised—" "You'll know how to use it when the time comes," Lily replied with that unsettling wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "This isn't about money, Mr. Thornton. It never was." As his car pulled away from the curb, Richard watched the abandoned school recede in the window, its darkened facade hiding the vibrant community within. For the first time in 5 years, he felt truly alive, and for the first time in much longer, he felt the weight of genuine responsibility. In the quiet of the car, Richard pulled out his phone and composed a text to his executive assistant. "Cancel all my meetings tomorrow. We have a new priority." Dawn found Richard Thornton in his home office, surrounded by holographic displays of property records, development plans, and financial projections. He had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and revelations. His legs ached pleasantly, an unfamiliar sensation that reminded him with every twinge that something miraculous had occurred. "You look terrible," Melissa commented as she entered with his morning coffee, setting it beside the untouched dinner tray from the previous night. "I need everything we have on alternative housing solutions," Richard replied, ignoring her concern. "Prefabricated units, rapid construction techniques, temporary housing with dignity, everything." Melissa's eyebrows rose. "May I ask what this is about?" Richard gestured to the central display, which showed aerial footage of the abandoned Blackwell Elementary School. 27 families, Melissa, living in an abandoned school because of our Riverside development." Understanding dawned on her face. "The community impact report you requested yesterday. I found them. Or rather, they found me." Richard swiped to another screen showing the original Riverside neighborhood before demolition. "I want to know every option for rehousing these people properly, and I want to know why our relocation assistance was so woefully inadequate." "I'll compile everything," Melissa promised. "But Richard, your physical therapy appointment is in 20 minutes. Doctor, Bennett was very clear that you need to begin a structured program immediately to capitalize on this recovery." Richard had almost forgotten about his own medical miracle amid the revelations of the night before. "Reschedule it for this afternoon and contact legal. I want to know our liability regarding the Riverside evictions." "Legal won't like that question," Melissa warned. "I don't much care what legal likes at the moment," Richard replied, his voice hardening. "Just get me answers." By mid-morning, Richard had formulated the beginnings of a plan. His executive team sat around the conference table, expressions ranging from confusion to concern as they reviewed his proposal. "Let me make sure I understand," his CFO James Westfield said carefully. "You want to allocate $15 million to purchase alternative housing for the displaced Riverside residents, without any legal obligation to do so." "That's correct." "Richard," the company attorney Sarah Chen interjected, "while I sympathize with your newfound social conscience, this creates a problematic precedent. If we acknowledge fault in the Riverside relocation, we open ourselves to similar claims from every development project of the past decade." Richard leaned forward. "I'm not concerned with precedent, Sarah. I'm concerned with 27 families living in an abandoned school building because our company prioritized profit over basic human decency." The room fell silent. In 20 years of leadership, Richard Thornton had never spoken this way. His ruthless business acumen had built Thornton Enterprises into a real estate empire precisely because he never let sentiment interfere with sound financial decisions. "There's also the matter of your health," James added delicately. "We're all thrilled about your unexpected recovery, but perhaps you should take some time to process everything before making major company decisions." Richard's expression hardened. "My health has nothing to do with this." But even as he said it, Richard knew it wasn't entirely true. His encounter with Lily had changed everything, not just his physical condition, but his perception of the empire he had built and the cost at which it had come. "I appreciate your concerns," he continued, softening his tone. "But my decision is final. Melissa will coordinate with each department on implementation. I want solutions, not objections." As the team filed out, Richard caught snippets of their whispered conversations. Complete personality transplant. Midlife crisis after the recovery. Board will never approve. Richard let them talk. For the first time in years, he felt certain about something beyond quarterly returns and market projections. That afternoon, Richard surprised Carson by requesting to return to Blackwell Elementary, alone. "Sir, I strongly advise against that," Carson protested. "At least let me accompany you." "Your presence makes them uncomfortable," Richard replied, transferring himself from the car to his wheelchair with practiced movements. His legs were stronger today, but still unreliable for walking distances. "Wait here, I won't be long." The school seemed different in daylight, more obviously dilapidated with its peeling paint and cracked windows, but also more clearly a home to the displaced families. Children played in what had once been the gymnasium, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. In a former classroom, adults hunched over sewing machines, repurposing donated fabrics into clothing and blankets. Richard found Eleanor in the library again, sorting through a box of canned goods with several other women. "Mr. Thornton," she greeted him, surprise evident in her voice. "We didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I've been thinking about our conversation," Richard said. "About what happened to your community because of my company's actions." Eleanor exchanged glances with the other women, who discreetly moved away to give them privacy. "I'd like to help," Richard continued. "Not just with money, but with finding a real solution. Proper homes for everyone here." Eleanor studied him with those penetrating eyes that reminded him so much of Lily's. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Thornton. But why now? Is it just because Lily helped you walk again?" The question struck at the heart of Richard's discomfort. Was his sudden concern for these people merely transactional, a response to his miraculous recovery, rather than genuine compassion? "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "Maybe initially. But seeing this place, hearing your stories, it's made me realize how disconnected I've been from the consequences of my business decisions." Eleanor seemed to appreciate his candor. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "I'd like to meet with everyone, discuss options. My company has resources that could make a real difference here." "The people here have been disappointed by promises before," Eleanor warned. "They won't be easily convinced of your sincerity." "I understand that," Richard replied. "I'm not asking for trust, just an opportunity to demonstrate that my intentions are genuine." Eleanor considered him for a long moment before nodding. "We have a community meeting every Thursday evening. You can present your ideas then." "Thank you." Richard glanced around the makeshift pantry they had created. "In the meantime, is there anything urgent you need? Supplies, repairs to the building?" A hint of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "The roof leaks in the east wing. We've been using buckets, but with winter coming—" "Consider it handled," Richard said immediately. "I'll have a crew here tomorrow." As Richard prepared to leave, he realized he hadn't seen Lily. "Is your granddaughter here?" "School," Eleanor replied. "Just because we live in one doesn't mean she gets to skip her education. The public library has an after-school program she attends." The normalcy of the answer surprised Richard. Somehow he'd begun to think of Lily as something otherworldly, the mysterious healer who had restored his legs, rather than as an ordinary child with ordinary responsibilities. "She's very special," he said awkwardly. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "but not because of what she did for you. She's special because despite everything she's lost and all the hardship she's seen, she still believes people can change for the better." She fixed Richard with a pointed look. "I hope she's right about you, Mr. Thornton." The weight of those words stayed with Richard as he returned to his waiting car. Carson opened the door without comment, though his expression registered surprise at Richard's unusually thoughtful demeanor. "Take me to the Riverside Development Site," Richard instructed as he settled into the back seat. 20 minutes later, Richard's wheelchair rolled along the temporary walkways of what would soon become Thornton Riverside Plaza, a gleaming mixed-use development of luxury condominiums, high-end retail, and exclusive office space. Construction crews swarmed over the partially completed structures like ants, the air filled with the sounds of progress. Hammering, drilling, the beeping of heavy machinery in reverse. Richard had visited the site countless times during planning, but now he saw it through new eyes. Where he had once envisioned stylish boutiques and elegant restaurants, he now saw the ghosts of the modest homes and small businesses that had stood here for generations. The urban renewal he had championed had erased a living, breathing community. His project manager, Kevin Zhang, hurried to meet him, hard hat in hand. "Mr. Thornton, we weren't expecting you today. If I'd known you were coming, I would have prepared a proper tour." "This isn't an official visit, Kevin," Richard replied. "I'm just reflecting." Kevin's enthusiasm faltered slightly. "Reflecting? Did you ever meet any of the residents who lived here before?" Richard asked, gesturing to the construction site around them. No, sir. That was handled by the acquisition team before construction began." "Of course it was," Richard murmured. He had designed his company's structure specifically to compartmentalize such processes, to insulate decision-makers like himself from the human consequences of their choices. "Is everything all right, sir?" Kevin asked, clearly unsettled by Richard's unusual questions. Richard didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to a massive concrete foundation being poured on the western edge of the site. "What's going in there?" "That's the wellness center, sir. Rooftop pool, spa facilities, meditation garden. It's one of the premium amenities for the condominium owners." Richard stared at the scale of it, the resources being poured literally into the ground for the comfort and pleasure of people who already had so much. Meanwhile, less than 2 miles away, families displaced by this very project were living in an abandoned school with a leaking roof. "Kevin," Richard said slowly, "how difficult would it be to modify our plans at this stage?" The project manager blanched. "Modify? Sir, we're already 6 months into construction. The permits, the contracts, the pre-sales agreements." "I understand the complications," Richard cut in, "but theoretically, could we repurpose some of this development for affordable housing? Maintain the commercial spaces, but convert a percentage of the residential units." Kevin looked as though Richard had suggested they build the entire complex upside down. "Technically, yes, but the financial implications would be enormous. The luxury units are pre-selling at $1,200 per square foot. Affordable housing would generate a fraction of that revenue." "Run the numbers anyway," Richard instructed. "I want options on my desk by Friday." As his car drove him back to his penthouse that evening, Richard reviewed the day's events with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Bennett reminding him about tomorrow's physical therapy session and expressing continued amazement at his recovery. Richard smiled faintly, remembering Lily's quiet confidence. The body remembers how to heal itself. Sometimes it just needs a reminder. Perhaps the same was true for other things as well: conscience, compassion, connection to others. Perhaps those too could be reawakened after long periods of dormancy. In his penthouse that night, Richard attempted something he hadn't tried since his stroke. He stood up from his wheelchair without assistance and took 3 halting steps toward the window. His legs trembled with the effort, muscles weak from years of disuse, but they held his weight. 3 steps became 5, then 10. By the time he reached the window overlooking the glittering city, sweat soaked his shirt, and his breathing came in hard gasps. But he was standing, walking on his own power. As he gazed out at the Boston skyline, at the empire of glass and steel he had helped create, Richard made a decision. The miracle Lily had given him wasn't just the return of his physical mobility. It was the opportunity to move in a new direction entirely. The Thursday community meeting at Blackwell Elementary arrived faster than Richard had anticipated. 3 days of intensive physical therapy had improved his mobility dramatically, though he still used a cane for stability, and his team had worked around the clock preparing proposals for the displaced families. As Richard's car approached the school, he noticed immediate changes. A construction crew was completing repairs on the roof, and a mobile generator hummed quietly behind the building, providing reliable electricity. These were small improvements he had authorized immediately, practical steps to demonstrate his commitment. Marcus greeted him at the entrance, his demeanor noticeably less hostile than during their first encounter. "Quite an entrance, Mr. Thornton," he commented, gesturing to the fleet of catering vans unloading behind Richard. Eleanor mentioned you wanted to provide dinner for the meeting, but this looks like enough to feed an army. I thought everyone might appreciate a proper meal, Richard replied. And please, call me Richard. Marcus's expression remained guarded, but he nodded. The cafeteria's this way. We've set up for the meeting there. More space than the library. The former school cafeteria had been transformed for the occasion. The catering staff Richard had hired moved efficiently, setting up serving stations along one wall. Folding tables arranged in a large circle filled the center of the room, an arrangement that Eleanor had insisted upon, so no one sits at the head, and everyone faces each other as equals. Families began filtering in, their reactions to the elaborate spread ranging from excitement to suspicious reservation. Children gravitated immediately to the dessert table, where an impressive array of cakes and pastries awaited. Richard noticed Lily among them, helping a younger child reach a chocolate cupcake. When she spotted him, she offered a small wave and made her way over. "You're using a cane," she observed. "Yes," Richard replied, leaning less heavily on it than he had that morning. "The doctors are calling it a medical miracle. They're writing papers about spontaneous neural regeneration." A hint of a smile touched Lily's lips. "Is that what they're calling it?" "What would you call it?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Lily considered the question with characteristic seriousness. A reminder. Of what? That nothing is permanent, not paralysis, not homelessness. Not who we think we are. Before Richard could respond to this surprisingly philosophical statement, Eleanor called the meeting to order. The families took their places around the large circle of tables, filling plates with the catered food. Richard noticed how they made sure the elderly and children were served first. A community, caring for its most vulnerable members, despite having so little themselves. Eleanor stood once everyone was settled. "As you all know, Mr. Thornton has asked to speak with us tonight about potential housing solutions. I've asked him to present his ideas, after which we'll have an open discussion." She turned to Richard. "Mr. Thornton, you have the floor." Richard rose carefully, still getting accustomed to standing for extended periods. He had addressed countless boardrooms and investor meetings throughout his career, but never had he felt as nervous as he did facing these families whose lives his business decisions had upended. "Thank you for allowing me to be here," he began, his usual corporate confidence giving way to genuine humility. "First, I want to acknowledge something important. My company's actions caused harm to your community. The Riverside development displaced you from your homes with inadequate support and compensation. That was wrong, and I am deeply sorry." A murmur rippled through the room. Corporate apologies were typically crafted by legal teams to avoid admitting fault. Richard's straightforward acknowledgement caught everyone by surprise. "I've spent the past few days reviewing alternatives with my team," he continued. "I'd like to present 3 options for your consideration." With that, Richard outlined the proposals: immediate relocation to quality temporary housing while permanent solutions were developed, financial compensation significantly above market value for those who preferred to find their own housing, or participation in a redesigned portion of the Riverside development that would include affordable housing units. The third option would take longest to implement, Richard explained, but it would mean returning to your original neighborhood, albeit in a different type of housing. As he spoke, Richard noticed the skeptical expressions around the room softening, though not disappearing entirely. These were people who had learned the hard way not to trust promises from powerful men. When he finished, Eleanor opened the floor for questions. They came rapidly, pointed and practical. What were the exact timelines? How would transportation to schools and jobs be handled during temporary relocation? What guarantees could he offer that these promises would be kept? Richard answered each question directly, without corporate doublespeak or evasion. When he didn't know an answer, he said so plainly and promised to find out. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, Eleanor called for a break. As the families dispersed to refill plates and discuss among themselves, Richard found a quiet corner to rest his legs, which were beginning to ache from the prolonged standing. Melissa approached with a tablet displaying urgent messages from the office. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow morning," she informed him quietly. "They've gotten wind of the Riverside redesign proposal." "I expected as much," Richard replied. "Schedule it for 9. "There's something else," Melissa added, her expression concerned. "Eleanor Wilson collapsed shortly after lunch today. Lily found her unconscious and called 911. She's at Boston General. Richard felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. What, but she's been here all evening running the meeting. She checked herself out against medical advice, Melissa explained. The doctors wanted to run more tests, but she insisted on being here for the community meeting. Richard immediately scanned the room for Eleanor, finding her in conversation with several other women. Now that he was looking for it, he could see the strain in her posture, the paleness beneath her composed expression. As the meeting reconvened, Richard modified his approach. He kept his remarks brief and focused on immediate next steps. A follow-up meeting with a smaller committee to finalize details, transportation arrangements for those who wanted to tour potential temporary housing options, and a dedicated phone line for questions and concerns. Throughout it all, he kept a watchful eye on Eleanor, noting how she occasionally pressed a hand to her side when she thought no one was looking. When the meeting concluded, Richard made his way directly to her. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand you were in the hospital earlier today." Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face, followed by resignation. "News travels fast. Why didn't you say something? This meeting could have been postponed. This community has waited long enough for solutions, Mr. Thornton. My personal matters could wait a few hours." Richard recognized the stubborn determination in her eyes. It reminded him of his own approach to business challenges. "At least let me drive you home. My car is waiting outside." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, the brief acquiescence revealing just how exhausted she truly was. "That would be appreciated. Lily should be finishing her homework in the library." Richard found Lily exactly where her grandmother had indicated, textbooks spread across a library table, her forehead creased in concentration over a math problem. "Your grandmother is ready to leave," he said gently. "She's agreed to let me drive you both home." Lily looked up, concern immediately replacing her academic focus. "Is she okay?" "She seems tired," Richard replied, carefully avoiding mentioning the hospital visit, in case Eleanor hadn't shared that information. Lily began gathering her books with practiced efficiency. "She won't tell me what's wrong, but I know something is. She thinks I don't notice her taking the pain pills, or how she barely eats anymore." The worry in the young girl's voice struck Richard deeply. This child, who had performed what could only be described as a miracle for him, was powerless to help the person she loved most. The ride to Blackwell was quiet, Eleanor dozing lightly in the plush back seat, while Lily stared out the window, her small face reflecting in the glass. When they arrived, Richard helped Eleanor from the car, alarmed at how heavily she leaned on his arm, despite her obvious attempts to disguise her weakness. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Thornton," Eleanor said formally once they reached the school entrance, "and for your proposals tonight. They offer real hope to our community." "Please call me Richard," he replied. "And please, see a doctor tomorrow. I'd be happy to arrange for a specialist." "That won't be necessary," Eleanor interrupted, her dignity firmly intact despite her evident discomfort. "Good night." As Eleanor made her way slowly inside, Lily lingered. "It's her kidneys," she said quietly. "I heard the doctor tell her when I was outside the examination room. They're failing." Richard felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Has she been to a nephrologist, a kidney specialist?" Lily shook her head. "We don't have health insurance. The emergency room doctor said she needs more tests, maybe dialysis soon, but..." She trailed off, the implications clear. "Lily," Richard said carefully, "I know your grandmother is very proud, but I could help with medical expenses." "It would be the least I could do after everything." "She won't take it," Lily interrupted with certainty. "Not for herself." "Then let me at least arrange for a specialist to see her. No bills, no paperwork, just a consultation." Lily considered this, her expression far too serious for a child her age. "I'll try to convince her," she finally said, "but I can't promise anything." "That's all I ask," Richard assured her. As Lily turned to follow her grandmother, he added, "Lily, why can't you heal her? Like you did for me?" The girl paused, her shoulders tensing slightly. When she turned back, Richard was stunned to see tears in her eyes, the first crack in her remarkable composure he had witnessed. "I've tried," she whispered. "Every night. It doesn't work." "But why? If you could heal a complete stranger..." "I don't know," Lily admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "Grandma says some things are meant to be and we can't change them, but that doesn't make sense. Why could I help you but not her?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. and heartbreaking. "Good night, Mr. Thornton," Lily said finally, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and disappearing through the school doors. Richard stood for a long moment in the cool evening air, leaning on his cane and staring at the dilapidated building that housed so many displaced lives. The contrast between this place and his luxury penthouse had never felt more stark or more shameful. Back in his car, Richard made a decision. "Take me to Boston General," he instructed his driver. It was nearly midnight when Richard arrived at the hospital, but his reputation and a generous donation to the hospital foundation ensured the chief of nephrology, Dr. Patel, was summoned from home for an urgent consultation. "I need to know everything about kidney failure," Richard stated without preamble when the sleepy but professional doctor arrived. "Treatment options, prognosis, everything." Dr. Patel's initial confusion gave way to clinical precision as she outlined the realities of end-stage renal disease, dialysis options, quality of life considerations, and ultimately, transplantation as the best long-term solution. "Transplant?" Richard repeated. "How difficult is it to find a donor?" "That depends," Dr. Patel explained. "Living donors provide better outcomes than deceased donors, but finding a compatible living donor can be challenging. Family members are tested first, but genetic compatibility doesn't guarantee tissue compatibility." "What about non-relatives?" Richard asked. "Could a stranger be a donor?" "Certainly. Altruistic, non-directed donation is becoming more common, though the matching process is still complex. Blood type is the first hurdle, followed by tissue typing and cross-matching." Richard absorbed this information with growing determination. "I want to be tested," he said finally, "to see if I could be a donor." Dr. Patel's professional demeanor slipped momentarily, revealing surprise. "Mr. Thornton, while I commend your generosity, organ donation is a serious medical procedure with significant recovery time and potential complications. It's not a decision to make impulsively at midnight." "I understand the seriousness," Richard replied, "but I also understand time may be of the essence for the patient in question. How quickly can the initial compatibility testing be done?" As the doctor outlined the testing protocols, Richard felt a curious sense of rightness settling over him. His newfound physical health, this second chance he'd been mysteriously granted, suddenly had a purpose beyond his own mobility. When he finally returned home in the early morning hours, Richard stood at his penthouse window, watching the city slowly awaken below. For the first time in years, his focus wasn't on the buildings he owned or the deals he could make, but on the people whose lives intersected with his, people like Eleanor and Lily, whose quiet dignity in the face of hardship had awakened something long dormant within him. Richard Thornton, who had built an empire by focusing relentlessly on the bottom line, found himself contemplating a different kind of investment altogether, one with no financial return, but with the potential for a far greater yield than any balance sheet could measure. The boardroom fell silent as Richard finished presenting his revised vision for the Riverside development. The stunned expressions of his executive team and board members told him everything he needed to know about how his proposal was being received. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," said Victor Landry, the longest-serving board member and Richard's mentor in his early career. "You want to redesign a half-completed billion-dollar luxury development to include affordable housing units. At a projected loss of," he glanced down at the report, "nearly $200 million. "That's correct," Richard replied calmly, standing at the head of the table without his cane, a deliberate choice to project strength despite the lingering weakness in his legs. "Richard," James, the CFO, interjected, "I understand you've had a profound personal experience with your recovery, but this isn't charity. This is business. We have obligations to our shareholders." "I'm well aware of our obligations," Richard countered. "I'm also aware that Thornton Enterprises has built its success on displacing vulnerable communities and gentrifying neighborhoods with no regard for the human cost. The Riverside project is simply the most recent example." The boardroom erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. No one had ever heard Richard Thornton, the ruthless business titan who had personally overseen dozens of similar projects, speak this way. "If I may," Sarah Chen, the company attorney, cut in, her voice measured. "The revised plan does address potential legal liabilities from the Riverside evictions. There have been rumblings about a class action lawsuit from former residents." This could be positioned as a proactive settlement. Richard nodded appreciatively at Sarah's attempt to frame his moral awakening in terms the board might accept, but he wasn't interested in pretense. "This isn't about avoiding lawsuits," he stated firmly. "It's about doing what's right. I've met these families, I've seen how our actions destroyed their community. We have a responsibility to make amends." Victor Landry leaned forward, concern etched on his weathered face. "Richard, I've known you for 30 years. You've never let sentiment interfere with sound business decisions. Is this about that girl? The one your security team mentioned in their report?" Richard tensed. He should have known Carson would include details about Lily in his security briefing. "My interest in helping these families stands on its own merits," he replied carefully. "But yes, meeting Lily and her grandmother has given me perspective I previously lacked. And this medical miracle of yours coincidentally occurred right after meeting her," Victor pressed. "Richard, have you considered that you might be being manipulated? These people could be taking advantage of your vulnerable state." The suggestion that Lily, who had refused his $1 million offer and asked only that he help her community, could be manipulating him was so absurd that Richard nearly laughed. Instead, he fixed Victor with a hard stare. "I've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning to announce the revised Riverside plan," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "I'm not asking for the board's permission. As majority shareholder, I'm informing you of my decision." Victor's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Richard. One that could undermine everything you've built." "Perhaps," Richard conceded. "Or perhaps I'm finally building something worth having." With that, he gathered his materials and left the boardroom, ignoring the stunned silence behind him. In the elevator down to the lobby, Richard checked his phone and found a message from Boston General Hospital. The preliminary compatibility tests had been completed. His blood type matched Eleanor's. Further tissue typing would be necessary, but the first hurdle had been cleared. A mixture of relief and nervous anticipation washed over him. He had refrained from mentioning the potential kidney donation to anyone, even Melissa. It wasn't a business decision to be dissected by his team or a PR opportunity to burnish his image. It was something else entirely, a personal reckoning, a chance for redemption. When he arrived at Blackwell that afternoon, Richard found the atmosphere transformed by a sense of cautious optimism. The community meeting had given people hope, and the immediate improvements he had authorized, the repaired roof, the reliable electricity, the improved sanitation facilities, demonstrated that his promises weren't empty words. Marcus approached as Richard made his way toward the library, where a smaller committee had gathered to discuss next steps for the housing proposals. "Your office sent over the preliminary plans for the temporary housing," Marcus said, falling into step beside him. "They look good. The committee has some questions about the timeline, but overall people are cautiously optimistic." "That's good to hear," Richard replied. "And Eleanor, is she here today?" Marcus's expression tightened. "She's at the hospital again. Lily went with her this time." Richard nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the concern that surged through him. "I hope it's nothing serious." "It's her kidneys," Marcus said bluntly. "We all know it, even though she tries to hide it. Dialysis starts next week, but..." He trailed off, the implications clear. Without insurance or financial resources, Eleanor's options were limited to emergency care that would manage but not solve her condition. "The hospital called me for financial information this morning," Marcus continued. "Eleanor listed me as her emergency contact. They wanted to know about insurance payment plans." He shook his head, frustration evident. "I did what I could, but dialysis is expensive. Long term, I don't know how she'll manage." "Let me help," Richard said immediately. "Please, Marcus, I can arrange everything anonymously if that would make it easier for her to accept." Marcus studied him for a long moment. "You know, when you first showed up here, I thought this was all some rich guy's guilt trip. A few charitable gestures to make yourself feel better before you went back to your penthouse and forgot about us." "And now?" Richard asked. A hint of a smile touched Marcus's weathered face. "Now I think Lily might have healed more than just your legs." Before Richard could respond to this unexpectedly perceptive comment, his phone rang. It was Dr. Patel from Boston General. "Mr. Thornton," her voice came through clearly, "I have the complete results of your compatibility testing with Eleanor Wilson." Richard's heart raced. "And?" "It's a remarkable match. better than we typically see even among blood relatives. All indicators suggest you would be an excellent donor candidate for Mrs. Wilson. Relief flooded through Richard. That's wonderful news. What's the next step? We would need to conduct a final cross-matching test and a thorough medical evaluation of both you and Mrs. Wilson, Dr. Patel explained. However, there's a complication. Mrs. Wilson has not consented to a transplant evaluation. In fact, she's been resistant to discussing long-term treatment options beyond dialysis. Richard frowned. She doesn't know I've been tested. I wanted to be sure it was possible before approaching her. I understand, Dr. Patel said gently. But Mr. Thornton, consent is fundamental to this process. Both donor and recipient must fully understand and agree to the procedure. Mrs. Wilson would need to consent not just to receiving a kidney, but specifically to receiving your kidney. Of course, Richard acknowledged. I'll speak with her. After ending the call, Richard changed his plans and headed to Boston General instead of attending the Housing Committee meeting. He found Eleanor in the nephrology department, hooked up to monitoring equipment, while a doctor reviewed her test results. Lily sat beside her, holding her grandmother's hand with a solemn expression that no child should have to wear. When Lily spotted Richard at the doorway, surprise flashed across her face. She whispered something to her grandmother, who turned with evident difficulty to see him. "Mr. Thornton," Eleanor said, her voice weaker than he remembered, but still carrying that dignified composure. "This is unexpected." "I heard you were here," Richard replied, stepping into the room. "I wanted to see if there was anything I could do." A tired smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Unless you have a spare kidney in your pocket, I'm afraid not." The opening was so perfect that Richard nearly laughed. "As a matter of fact, I might." Confusion crossed Eleanor's face. "I don't understand." Richard moved closer to her bedside, aware of Lily's intense gaze following him. "I've been tested as a potential donor, Eleanor. The results came back positive. I'm compatible." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady beep of the monitoring equipment. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief, while Lily's eyes widened with a surge of hope. "You, what?" Eleanor finally managed. "I want to donate a kidney to you," Richard stated simply. "The doctors say I'm an excellent match." Eleanor shook her head, bewilderment giving way to firm refusal. No, absolutely not. I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Thornton, but I couldn't possibly accept such a thing." "Why not?" Richard asked. "Because it's too much. A kidney isn't a charitable donation or a business transaction. It's part of your body." "I'm well aware of what a kidney is," Richard replied calmly, "and I'm offering mine freely with full understanding of what that means." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Is this about Lily? About what she did for you?" "Because if you think you owe us something, this isn't about debt," Richard interrupted. "Though if it were, the scales would still be tipped heavily in your favor." "Then what is it about?" Eleanor challenged. Richard considered the question carefully. "Connection," he finally said. "For most of my life, I've lived as though my success existed in isolation from others. As though my wealth and position were solely the result of my own efforts, unconnected to the communities my business decisions affected. Lily helped me see that connection, not just by helping me walk again, but by showing me the true cost of my actions." Eleanor's stern expression softened slightly, but she shook her head again. "It's too much risk for you. The surgery, the recovery, I've discussed all of that with the doctors," Richard assured her. "The risks are minimal compared to the benefit to you." "And what does your family think about this decision?" Eleanor asked pointedly. Richard's smile was tinged with sadness. "I don't have family, Eleanor. No wife, no children. My parents have been gone for years. The closest thing I have to family are employees who are paid to care about my welfare." The room fell silent again as Eleanor processed this. Richard could see the conflict in her eyes, the desperate need for the life-saving transplant warring with her pride and her reluctance to accept such a profound gift from someone who had been a stranger just days ago. Lily, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. "Grandma, please." Her voice trembled with emotion. "Please say yes." Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, at the pleading in her eyes, and Richard could see her resistance crumbling. "I need time to think," she finally said. "Of course," Richard replied. "But the doctors tell me time is something you don't have in abundance right now." As Richard prepared to leave, giving Eleanor space to process his offer, Lily followed him into the hallway. "Thank you," she said simply, those two words carrying the weight of emotions too complex for her young vocabulary to express. Richard knelt carefully to her eye level, his newly healed legs still requiring conscious effort for such movements. "You know, the doctors can't explain how my nerves regenerated after 5 years of paralysis." Lily met his gaze steadily. "What do you think happened?" "I think you reminded my body how to heal itself," Richard replied, echoing her own words from their first encounter. "And now, in a different way, you've reminded my conscience how to function too." The girl's solemn expression gave way to a small, genuine smile, the first Richard had seen from her. "Maybe that's the real miracle," she suggested. Richard couldn't help but smile in return. "Maybe it is." 2 days later, Eleanor Wilson finally consented to the transplant. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, giving Richard time to complete his own pre-surgical evaluations and to put his business affairs in order. The press conference announcing the revised Riverside development plan generated exactly the controversy Richard had expected. Business publications questioned his judgment, shareholders threatened lawsuits, and real estate analysts predicted the decision would undermine Thornton Enterprises' market position. Richard weathered the storm with newfound serenity, focusing instead on the immediate needs of the Blackwell community. The first families were already moving into the temporary housing he had arranged, apartments in a recently renovated building that Thornton Enterprises had acquired specifically for this purpose. Each family had been consulted about their needs, ensuring that proximity to schools, workplaces, and medical facilities was prioritized in the placements. The night before his surgery, Richard visited Blackwell one last time. The population had already decreased by nearly a third as families relocated to the temporary housing, but the school still hummed with community activity. A makeshift banner hung in the cafeteria. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." It was decorated with children's handprints and signatures. Marcus found him standing before it, unexpectedly moved by the simple gesture. "You've done good here," he said, clapping Richard on the shoulder. "Whatever your reasons." "I wish I'd done it sooner," Richard replied honestly. "Better late than never," Marcus offered. "Eleanor told us about tomorrow. The whole community will be thinking of you both." As Richard prepared to leave, Lily appeared in the cafeteria doorway. She approached with her characteristic direct manner. "Are you scared?" "About tomorrow?" The question caught Richard off guard with its perceptiveness. "A little," he admitted, "though I suspect not as much as your grandmother is." Lily nodded. "She's pretending to be brave for me, and I'm pretending to believe her." Richard smiled at this astute observation. "That's what family does, I think. Pretends for each other when reality is too difficult to face directly." "We're having a prayer circle tonight," Lily informed him. "For both of you." "I know you probably don't believe in that stuff, but I'd be honored," Richard interrupted sincerely. "In fact, I've learned not to dismiss things just because I don't understand how they work." Lily smiled at that. "Like spontaneous healing." "Exactly like that." As Richard's driver took him home for his last night before surgery, he found himself reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led him here. In less than 2 weeks, his life had transformed completely. Not just his physical abilities, but his understanding of success, responsibility, and connection. Tomorrow he would literally give a piece of himself to save Eleanor Wilson's life. The woman whose community his business had destroyed would receive his kidney in a symmetry that felt both ironic and profoundly right. Richard Thornton, who had built an empire on the principle that worth was measured in dollars and assets, was discovering a different kind of currency altogether, one that couldn't be tracked on spreadsheets or annual reports, but that somehow felt infinitely more valuable. 3 years later, autumn sunlight filtered through the golden leaves of newly planted maple trees, casting dappled shadows across the dedication plaque. Eleanor Wilson Community Center, where healing begins. The renovated Riverview Park hummed with activity as families gathered for the center's grand opening, children racing across the expansive playground, while adults chatted in small groups, many wearing t-shirts emblazoned with the center's lotus flower logo. Richard Thornton stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. At 65, he looked markedly different from the bitter man who had first visited this park 3 years ago. The perpetual scowl had softened into laugh lines around his eyes. The rigid posture of a man constantly bracing against vulnerability had given way to a more relaxed bearing. He still used a cane occasionally on days when his legs tired easily, a small reminder of both his former paralysis and his remarkable recovery. "Nervous about your speech?" Melissa asked, appearing at his side with a tablet containing his talking points for the ceremony. Richard smiled. "Not nervous, just reflective." "Well, reflect quickly. The mayor just arrived, which means we're starting in 15 minutes. As Melissa hurried off to coordinate with the event staff, Richard continued his silent observation of the gathering. The crowd represented a remarkable cross-section of Boston society. Former Blackwell residents, now settled in the mixed-income housing development that had replaced the original luxury condominiums. Community organizers who had initially protested the Riverside project and now partnered with the Thornton Foundation, and city officials who had gone from skeptics to supporters of Richard's radical business transformation. "There you are," came a familiar voice. "Hiding from your own party?" Richard turned to find Marcus approaching, dressed in a suit that still looked slightly uncomfortable on his muscular frame. As the newly appointed Director of Community Engagement for the Thornton Foundation, Marcus had been instrumental in ensuring the renovated park and community center truly served neighborhood needs. "And not hiding," Richard replied, "just taking it all in." Marcus nodded in understanding. "It's something, isn't it? 3 years ago, most of these people were living in an abandoned school building. And I was a very different person," Richard added quietly. "That you were," Marcus agreed with characteristic bluntness. "Speaking of transformations, your special guest just arrived." Richard followed Marcus's gaze to the park entrance, where Eleanor Wilson was making her way slowly along the path, supported by a younger woman on one side and using a walking stick on the other. At 82, Eleanor moved more deliberately than she once had, but her posture remained proudly erect, her silver hair still pulled back in that same neat bun. And beside her, tall and poised in a white medical coat, walked Lily. Richard's heart swelled at the sight of her. No longer the solemn child who had knelt beside his wheelchair with impossible confidence, Lily had blossomed into a composed young woman of 15. Her acceptance into Boston's prestigious medical preparatory program had been the subject of a feature in the city newspaper last month, highlighting her extraordinary journey from homelessness to academic excellence. Richard approached them, embracing Eleanor with gentle care. "You're looking well," he told her sincerely. "As are you," she replied, her sharp eyes assessing him with that familiar directness. "Though you could use more sun. Still working too much, I suspect." Richard chuckled. "Some habits die hard." He turned to Lily, who surprised him with a warm hug. "The white coat suits you," he observed when they separated. Lily grinned, touching the lapel of her medical coat with evident pride. "It's just for the ceremony. I don't get a real one until medical school." "Which will happen," Eleanor stated with absolute certainty. "My granddaughter has already been invited to interview at Johns Hopkins' early admission program." "I'm not surprised," Richard said. "Dr. Bennett tells me her volunteer work at the hospital has impressed everyone in the nephrology department." A soft chime from Richard's phone interrupted their conversation. Melissa signaled that the ceremony was about to begin. "We should take our seats," he said, offering his arm to Eleanor. The ceremony unfolded with the efficiency that characterized all Thornton events, even after the company's dramatic restructuring. The mayor spoke about urban renewal done right. Community leaders acknowledged the unprecedented collaboration between developers and residents, and children from the local elementary school performed a song specially composed for the occasion. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he approached the podium with measured steps, taking a moment to survey the gathered crowd before beginning. "3 years ago, I sat in this park as a different man," he began, setting aside Melissa's prepared remarks. "I was wealthy beyond measure, but impoverished in all the ways that truly matter. I had buildings named after me across this city, but no real connection to the communities those buildings served, or sometimes displaced." A murmur of recognition rippled through the audience. Richard's transformation from ruthless developer to community advocate had become something of a local legend. Many of you know part of my story, how an encounter with a remarkable young girl led to a physical healing that doctors still cannot fully explain. He gestured toward Lily, who sat straight-backed beside her grandmother in the front row. "What fewer people know is that the true miracle wasn't the return of sensation to my legs. It was the return of sensation to my conscience." Richard paused, gathering his thoughts. "The Eleanor Wilson Community Center we dedicate today represents more than just a building. It represents a new model of development, one that recognizes that true prosperity cannot come at the expense of our most vulnerable neighbors, one that acknowledges that we rise or fall together as a community. As he continued his speech, Richard caught Eleanor dabbing discreetly at her eyes despite her usual stoic demeanor. The community center named in her honor would provide medical services, educational resources, job training and childcare to the surrounding neighborhoods, ensuring that no family would ever again face the desperate circumstances the Blackwell residents had endured. And now, Richard concluded, I'd like to invite someone special to join me for the ribbon cutting. Someone whose wisdom and courage continue to inspire me daily. Instead of calling Eleanor forward, as everyone expected, Richard gestured to Lily. A collective murmur of surprise rippled through the audience as the teenager made her way to the podium, her expression momentarily betraying her own shock before composing into that familiar, calm confidence. Richard handed her the ceremonial scissors. "The future of this community belongs to its youngest members," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "And I can think of no better hands to place it in than those that once reminded a broken man how to heal." Together, they cut the ribbon, triggering a cascade of applause and cheers. As photographers captured the moment, Richard whispered to Lily, "I have something for you." When the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed to explore the new facility, Richard led Lily and Eleanor to his office in the administrative wing. On his desk sat an elegant envelope bearing the Thornton Foundation logo. "I wanted to give you this privately," he explained, handing the envelope to Lily. It seemed more appropriate than a public presentation. Lily opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "This is a full scholarship," Richard confirmed. "Medical school, living expenses, everything. The first grant from the new Thornton Medical Scholars Program." "Richard," Eleanor began, her voice thick with emotion, "this is too generous. First the kidney, now this." "The kidney was a gift," Richard interrupted gently. "This is an investment. In Lily. And in all the patients she'll heal throughout her career." Lily looked up from the scholarship letter, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Richard assured her. "Just fulfill that remarkable potential of yours." As they left his office, Richard noticed a familiar figure waiting in the hallway, Victor Landry, his former mentor, and the last holdout from the old Thornton Enterprises board. Though officially retired now, Victor had remained a vocal critic of Richard's company transformation. "Victor," Richard greeted him with genuine warmth, despite their professional differences. "I'm glad you could make it." "Wouldn't have missed it," the older man replied, his gaze moving curiously between Richard and his guests. "So this is the famous Lily Wilson." Richard made the introductions, watching as Victor studied Lily with undisguised interest. "I've heard a great deal about you, young lady," Victor said. "Richard attributes quite remarkable abilities to you." Lily met his skeptical tone with her characteristic directness. "Mr. Thornton gives me too much credit. Sometimes people just need a reminder of what they already know is right." Victor's eyebrows rose at her mature response. "And sometimes, apparently, they need a reminder of how to make their legs work after 5 years of paralysis." "Victor," Richard warned. "It's all right," Lily assured him before addressing Victor again. "Medicine still has a lot to learn about the connection between mind and body. I'm going to study it properly at medical school." A reluctant smile touched Victor's lips. "Well, you certainly have Richard convinced. He's turned a billion-dollar real estate empire into a social enterprise because of you." "Not because of me," Lily corrected. "Because he remembered who he wanted to be before money became more important than people." Victor studied the teenager with newfound respect. "You're quite something, Ms. Wilson." He turned to Richard. "I still think you're crazy, but seeing all this today," he gestured to the bustling community center around them, "I'm starting to think it might be the right kind of crazy." After Victor departed, Eleanor excused herself to rest before the evening reception, leaving Richard and Lily alone in the sunlit corridor. "He still doesn't believe I healed you," Lily observed. Richard smiled. "Victor needs spreadsheets and scientific explanations. Some things defy both." They walked together toward the center's glass atrium, where community members explored interactive exhibits showcasing the neighborhood's history, including honest documentation of the displacement caused by the original Riverside development and the collaborative redesign that had followed. "Do you ever wonder why it happened?" Lily asked suddenly. Why you could walk again? Richard considered the question carefully. I've thought about it every day for 3 years, he admitted. I've consulted with medical experts, spiritual leaders, even physicists trying to understand quantum healing. None of their explanations feel complete. And what do you think? Lily pressed. Richard gazed out at the park where their journey had begun, where a bitter man in a wheelchair had mockingly challenged a solemn child to perform a miracle. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes the universe offers second chances. Not just for legs that can't walk, but for hearts that have forgotten how to feel. The real miracle wasn't that I stood up from that wheelchair. It was that I finally saw the world around me clearly. Lily nodded, a wisdom beyond her years reflected in her expression. Grandma says healing happens in many forms. Your grandmother is a very wise woman, Richard replied with a smile. I'm grateful every day that my kidney found such a good home with her. Later that evening, as the community celebration continued under strings of twinkling lights, Richard found himself standing in the exact spot where he had first encountered Lily 3 years ago. The park had been transformed, new playground equipment, accessible pathways, native plantings, but the memory remained vivid in his mind. Eleanor joined him, moving carefully but steadily. Penny for your thoughts, she said, coming to stand beside him. Just reflecting on journeys, Richard replied, and how they rarely take us where we expect. Eleanor nodded in understanding. When I first met you, I thought you were just another rich man trying to ease his conscience with charity. I never imagined you'd become family. The word touched Richard deeply. After a lifetime of solitary achievement, the connection he had formed with Eleanor and Lily, and by extension with the entire community, had filled a void he hadn't acknowledged even to himself. Speaking of family, Eleanor continued, Lily has something for you. She's been waiting for the right moment. As if on cue, Lily approached, carrying a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. What's this? Richard asked as she handed it to him. Open it, Lily urged, an unusual hint of nervousness in her voice. Richard carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a hand-carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, lay a folded check, the same check he had written to Lily 3 years ago, promising $1 million if she could make him walk again. The check had never been cashed. Richard looked up in confusion. I don't understand. Lily took a deep breath. You kept your promise to me even though I never asked you to. You made me a millionaire, just not with money. She gestured to the thriving community around them, to the scholarship that would carry her through medical school, to her grandmother standing healthy beside her. You gave me something worth much more than $1 million. With deliberate movements, Lily took the check from the box and tore it in half. You've already paid, she said softly, echoing the words Richard had often thought but never expressed. The simple gesture, this formal releasing of a debt that had been settled in ways far more meaningful than money, moved Richard unexpectedly. He found himself blinking back tears as he pulled both Lily and Eleanor into a gentle embrace. As the three stood together in the twilight, surrounded by the community they had helped rebuild, Richard Thornton reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him here. A journey that had begun with a bitter challenge issued in mockery and had culminated in a transformation none of them could have imagined. The impossible had indeed happened, not just the healing of his paralyzed legs, but the awakening of a paralyzed heart. And in that awakening, Richard had discovered that true wealth could never be measured in dollars or real estate, but in the lives touched and the communities strengthened along the way. Above them, the first stars of evening appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a miracle that continued to unfold with each passing day, the miracle of connection, of redemption, and of healing in all its many forms. Fim da Historia. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard, Eleanor, and Lily's story has touched your heart. Their journey reminds us that true healing often goes beyond the physical. It transforms relationships, communities, and even the most hardened hearts. For more emotionally powerful stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of human connection and the power of transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Richard and Lily's journey resonated with you the most? Your engagement helps our community grow, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that inspire and move you. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we open our hearts to others.